Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the second and this installment of Unitas 100 International Lecture Series, which has been the journal's pre-centennial offering to its loyal readers and the world of scholarship. I'm your host, Francis Kilantang. Unitas, as you know, is the oldest extant multidisciplinary journal in the country, billed as a journal for advanced research on literature, culture, and society. It was established in 1922 and will be a century old in 2022. This lecture series, which is open to all for free, is Unitas's gift to its loyal readers and the world of scholarship. Unitas is open access and its digital archive since 1922 at the UST Library is available to all. Today is a special back-to-back lecture session. Unitas is proud to present Professor Woosung of Seoul National University, South Korea, who will deliver a talk on the geographies of the East Asian cinematography, the Taiwan Convergence. And Professor will be also having later Professor Jeffrey Cabusao of Bryant University of Rhode Island, USA, who will deliver a talk on Carlos Bulosan and Filipino collective memory, teaching, transgression, and transformation. We shall start with Professor Woosung and his respondent, Professor Joel David of Inha University in South Korea. Moving on to Professor Jeffrey Cabusao and his respondent, Mr. Victor Bautista of the University of the Philippines. Professor Kang's lecture reads as the nodal point of converging the continental Sinophone cinematic circuit of Shanghai, Hong Kong axis, and the maritime Hollywood-Japan cinematic circuit, Taiwan New Cinema from 1982 to 1987 combined three strata. We have post-coloniality, ideological politics, and cultural hybridity of the East Asian cinematic infrastructure. Its influence continues in new cinema in mainland China during the 1990s, the fin de siècle Hong Kong cinema, and the South Korean cinematic renaissance or K-cinema after the new millennium. The intention of this lecture is to theoretically frame the geographical mutation of what we call the East Asian cinematic plane from the 1930s to the present. Historically, there have been two parallel cinematic axes in the modern East Asian culture or cultural geography. The continental, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taipei, curve, and the maritime, Hollywood, Tokyo, Taipei. The former could be roughly defined by the devotion to epic drama and dynamic cinema of spectacle. The latter belongs to the relatively static, speculative, and observant aesthetics of realism. After the Cold War and the deadline of studio system, the cultural vitality of East Asian cinema moved to Taiwan and Hong Kong during the 1980s. Taiwan became the modernist convergence point of two regional flows, peripheral modernism, with Hong Kong as its East Asian partner coping with postmodern cultural capitalism or hybrid postmodernity. In this geographical mutation of the East Asian cinematic plane, Taiwan New Wave constitutes the moment of what we call minor cinema, with which the East Asian cinema contributes to the making of world cinema. Now, for the lecture, We shall begin with the lecture first of Professor Woosung, which will be followed by some remarks from the respondent, Joel David. After a brief exchange between them, the forum will be open to the audience, who may ask questions or give their remarks by turning on their microphone. You may type your inquiries on the chat box and address that to the speakers directly. The audience may also just write their questions on other channels. Perhaps you want to remain anonymous, you can message us as well. Either way, please introduce yourself first. But first, allow me to introduce our first pair of esteemed guests. So first, we have Professor Woosung Kang, as mentioned, as our guest lecturer for the first half of our lecture today. Professor Woosung is a professor of Department of English and Comparative Literature program at Seoul National University, Korea. He was a visiting scholar at University of Pennsylvania from 2012 to 2013 and National Taiwan University from 2019 to 2020. His research area includes American literature and culture, politics and aesthetics, critical theories, psychoanalysis, film theory, and Asian cinemas. He is the author of Freud Seminar in 2019, Painting as the Gaze of Philosophy, 2014, Poe Translated, 2014, The Birth of a Style, Emerson and the Writing of the Moment in the American Renaissance, 2003. He published articles on American literatures, Japanese films, deconstruction, Deleuze, and other theorists. He translated Slavoj Zizek, Pandemic in 2020, and Pandemic 2 in 2021, Timothy Snyder's Our Malady, 2021, and Avital Ronell's Stupidity, 2015, into Korean. And now, working on the geographies of East Asian cinema, the Taiwan Convergence, and political Derrida. Prof. Kang is a new member of the International Board of Editor of UNITAS. Meanwhile, Professor Joel David, as the respondent, Sir David or Professor David is a professor of cultural studies at Inha University in Incheon, Korea. He holds a doctorate in cinema studies from New York University, where he initially attended a Fulbright scholar. He started teaching long ago at the University of the Philippines, which has become the country's national university. After being the first graduate of its film program before leaving for Korea, he became founding director of the UP Film Institute and successfully drafted and defended its master's program. He has written several books and edited several journal issues on Philippine cinema. His out-of-print and recent output is posted on his archival website, Amateurish. His recent book on the controversial 1980 movie Manila by Night elicited rave reviews from several journals, including Jump Cut, the US's pioneering feminist film journal. He has received several Life Achievement Awards for film, scholarship, and criticism. Starting in 2016 with the Fanzine International Film Festival in San Francisco, California, and culminating so far with this year's Balagtas Award from the Writers Union of the Philippines. Professor David is a member of the International Board of Editors of UNITAS. And without further ado, let me introduce to you Professor Woosung in his lecture.
Hi, this is Woosung, and I'm going to give you a lecture about the Taiwanese new cinema as a series of lecture for the UNITA's 100-year celebration. I'm really honored to be invited by this journal, and I'm really grateful for the invitation of Professor Reyes. And today I'm going to talk about the East Asian cinema in terms of Taiwanese new wave and its historical significance. And my lecture is about 40 minutes or something, and next week I will talk directly with you in online discussion. So let me try to share my PowerPoint files with you, and I'm talk about today's topic, East Asian cinema and its Taiwan convergence. Yeah. So the approach that I'm taking in this lecture is slightly different from the ones that persistently discussed throughout the East Asian cinema scholars. And right now there is a two distinctive trend or tendency of East Asian cinema scholars that when they talking about the Taiwan new wave or Taiwan new cinema during the 1980s, what they are trying to talk about is that, you know, most of the Taiwanese scholars talk about the national distinction of this Taiwan new cinema, but the recently some of the new scholars talk about the Taiwan new cinema as a kind of not national cinema, but as a transnational cinema that covers not just Taiwan island, but you know, this East Asian cultural settings. But I'm going to try. I'm trying to I'm trying to say that the concept of East Asian cinema is not just a regional definition of the cinemas that produced in East Asian regions, but it's kind of conceptual term that describes that any national cinemas has these regional characteristics in distinction from the world cinema or the, you know, the Western cinema and sort of that. So my first starting point is to talk about you know, this the documentary that talk about the Taiwan new cinema. It was made by Chilin Xue in 2014. It's called Flowers of Taipei, and it's Chilin Xue interviewed a lot of people, like, you know, you see this all kind of uh, clips and interviews that combined in this documentary film, and it talks about how the Taiwan new cinema in the 1980s, you know, has some kind of signification in the world cinema. You see this Asian director like Apichatpong Wirasataku or Jia Zhangke and other directors, and as well as these Western cinema profiles. So this Flowers of Taipei talks about how Taiwan new cinema during the 1980s made possible by various effects, and but the most of the film's you know, tone veers towards this nostalgic or retrospective approach to the sudden flowering and the demise of national cinema. But it also attempts to place the glorious past of Taiwanese cinema as the significant moments of the so-called world cinema. So interestingly, while most of the foreign interviewees remember the shock and wonder of their first encounter with cinema Taiwanese and its lasting impact. But Taiwan interviewees, including Hou Xiaoxian and Chai Mingyang and other directors, display a very skeptical response to their own achievement. So the foreign interviewers always praise how good and how glorious this past was, but Taiwanese directors are very cynical about their own achievement. So this discrepancy is nothing new because Taiwanese cinema, as a national cinema, failed to boost the subsequent cinematic follow-up in the Taiwan island, unable to earn the domestic popularity, whereas it's already inscribed in the international festival circuit and art house cinema, an indelible mark of creativity as the minor cinema, totally unprecedented in the world cinema history. So I'm going to talk about the minor cinema, the concept of minor cinema as a key word for describing Taiwanese new wave. As you already know, probably a lot of people know that these 5 directors suddenly appears in 1980s, and they produced this significant world historical cinema product out of this small island. You see the Hou Xiaoxian and Edward Yang and other directors. Yeah, this is very famous picture that talk about a lot of people involved in this cinematic new movement. So my starting point is that the Flowers of Taipei, the documentary that describes the Taiwan new cinema, is very much interesting because there is any mention of Hollywood factors, and there is no Hollywood interviewees who talks about Taiwanese cinema, and it's very interesting, and the Hollywood effect is very much prevalent in Taiwan right now, but during the 1980s, there was nothing particularly interesting and influenced by the Hollywood cinema. So why was in Taiwan there was no Hollywood effect in Taiwan? It's the first question that I would like to talk about. Despite the Taiwan New Wave has no Hollywood influence, the film market and the box office in Taiwan, at least since 1990s, predominantly under the grip of Hollywood. The popular market is always in Hollywood films and cinemas all around the country. And so this one of the scholars talks about the situation in Taiwan film market as this with regard to the consumption. The Hollywood is the de facto national cinema of Taiwan, just as politically the United States guarantees Taiwan's liminal existence. So that's the the situation that the popular market and films and theaters and everywhere, the Hollywood films and cinemas are everywhere in Taiwan, but there was nothing particularly Taiwanese in the Taiwan new wave during 1980s. So I'd like to talk about why this absence of Hollywood effect is significant in Taiwanese cinema. And the forerunner of Taiwan cinema study is the Frederick Jameson, who talks about the global geopolitical aesthetic, and he takes example from Taiwanese cinema, especially Edward Yang and Hou Xiaoxian. So I'd like to share you the Frederick Jameson's idea that how he sees the Taiwan cinema as a kind of aesthetic new wave. So Frederick Jameson talks about that, quote, I suspect in any case that the opposite of Westernization in such contemporary arguments cannot be China itself. So he thinks that Westernization of modernity or something like that cannot be the opposite of the China right now. So this is Jameson's argument against the framework of Western or Oriental kind of thinking. But that is empty place most readily filled by the question of some putative Taiwanese identity that is itself as much a problem as it is a solution. But he also refused to replace the place of China with a Taiwanese identity because there is no definite kind of identity that can be resorted to the Taiwan cinema. So in that sense, perhaps what is being objected to in the film by Edward Yang is not so much his failure to be Chinese or Taiwanese, as a relative absence from it of any ostensible worry about the nature of Taiwanese identity or any rehearsal of its very possibility. So when you see the Taiwanese new cinema, you probably know that there is any kind of thinking about the identity of Taiwanese national identity. So so this is very symptomatic, and Jameson talks about that this is the peculiar situation that we encounter when you approach the phenomenon of Taiwanese new cinema. So the Jameson continues to talk about the feature this Taiwanese new cinema as a kind of third world cinema. You know that Frederick Jameson is very famous about theory of postmodernity and things like that. But he is very interested in third world cinema. But I don't think the third world term can be applied to Taiwanese cinema. So the Jameson said that, quote, I will not belabor the interesting theoretical issues of whether Taiwan is to be counted as a third world country. If you think the label the third world means certain tier poverty, then it is clearly inappropriate, if not worse. But if it merely affirms something as structural and descriptive as the non-adherence to what is left of the socialist bloc, coupled with the constitutive distance from one of the three great capital centers of the New World Order, which means Japan, Western Europe, and the United States, that it may be less misleading. So it has some kind of third world features, but not, could not be defined exactly as a third world country. But it has something different from the first or second world centers of the world. Jameson is very skeptical of here two kind of things that, first he takes a cautious approach concerning the formula Orientalist distinction that mystifies China as the opposite of the West, but is at the same time reluctant to replace it with Taiwanese identity. Jameson's hesitation suggests that Taiwanese identity, if there is one, is not to be conceptualized, unlike China, in opposition to the Western modernity. That is, for this very reason, it could be a substitute for China. But the other suspicion of James's argument involves the singular nature of Edward Young's, and by extension, Taiwan New Wave's cinematic umbelt. Against the accusation of failure positive identity formation, Jameson advocates the late modern sensibility of Taiwan New cinema, which transcends or sublates the whole problematic of national identity at one stroke. So socially modernized, fully modernized, but not westernized like Japan, Taiwan displays for Jameson a peculiar modernity, irreducible either to post-coloniality or hybrid postmodernity. And that's why Jameson takes particular interest in Taiwan New Wave's cinematic technique of synchronous, nomadic simultaneity. Yeah. Very much, complex concept. Synchronous, nomadic simultaneity. So, when you approach this Taiwan New cinema, what Jameson talks about is that you can find something synchronous, but this is not, linear, but it's like a complex of 3 or 4 different kind of simultaneous, non-simultaneous things together in that one space. That's what Jameson talks about Taiwanese new cinema. So the Taiwan New Wave amounts to the event of national cinema, which is true to Taiwan's geographical and geopolitical specificity, without presupposing any pre-given idea of national identity. Yeah, that's very interesting concept. So caught in the middle of political and ideological conundrum with communist China and domestic anti-communist authoritarianism, still suffering from the ambivalent trauma from the Japanese colonial inheritances, and under the constant double pressure from the global participation and the cultural independence Taiwan provides new wave cinema with totally singular images of modernity and rhythms of rural life in discordance with the relentless logic of globalization. And you're taking the lead from Friedrich Jameson's idea of peripheral modernity, or late modern phenomenon in Taiwan, which is clearly different from the First and Second World, and it shows that it's synchronous things that that cannot happen together. I would like to leave focus of this Taiwan new cinema as kind of convergent point of two different cultural flows that was apparent historically in the East Asian regions. And when you see this picture diagram, that there's a two kind of cultural flows are going on between among the East Asian nations. So one is that continues to grow, and centering upon the mainland China, and you see that Shanghai and Guangzhou, which are the two main cities that has connection with the Western civilization during the 1980s, 18th century or 19th centuries up to the 1945. And you see that Hong Kong it's the part of this mainland flow, but very close to Taipei. And there's another one, that another cultural flow that was apparent at least in 1945, after the the surrender of Japanese Empire, is that there is a continuous presence of United States through Japan and Taiwan. So there is a certain kind of maritime oceanic influence that came from United States through Japan, and it comes to Taiwan. And there is another continental flow that always circles around this mainland China to Shanghai and Guangzhou and Hong Kong. So this is, the what I call the cinematic to bifurcate cultural flows in East Asian cinematic sphere. Um, so why East Asian framework is matters matters in the in terms of cinema is that this concept of East Asian cinema does not allow any kind of national framework. National cinema is a concept, a very recent invention of the scholars of cinematic field, and they try to talk about how every kind of national cinema comes from the national soil, but it has uh, um, you know the problem that anytime the cultural product has transnational boundaries. So there's another idea that transnational rather than national is what defines every national cinema. But for me, transnational is also still, connected with the national boundaries, but they don't have any significant kind of connection between the national cinemas. They just, as a conceptual framework, it suggests that there is a multinational or international or transnational, which is, wider term than the national cinemas. And the idea of East Asian cinema also refused to accept the Eurocentrism. As Frederick Jameson said that, Taiwan new cinema can be included under the term of third world cinema, but it's also still and concentrate on the three division of the world picture, so that there's a first world and second world and the third world. The third world is not does not belong to these two worlds, which is periphery of the center. And the East Asian cinema also avoids included in this global, local, and regional framework. So East Asian is not just a regional, it's more than a regional term, and it also includes the cultural and geographical situations. And also the East Asian framework avoids coping with co-opted with the idea of core peripheral and colonial framework of the global capitalism. So it has some kind of peripheral features, but it is not defined against the core of the capitalist regime. So it's a kind of intra-regional concept. So as I talk about the two cultural flows in the East Asian culture, there is a two bifurcations. So this cultural bifurcation has some merit advantage over geopolitical framework that is very much prevalent throughout the entire field of East Asian studies. Right now, people used to talk about the East Asia as a political term, geopolitical term that always talks about the China, Japan, and U.S. And in terms of past, there was talk about the Cold War confrontation between the First and Second World, or the U.S. and as a free world, and the China and Russia as a communist bloc. So it does not actually has some kind of advantage of explaining what's going on in the cultural field. So I would like to go to the geocultural framework rather than geopolitical one. So it's when you see this whole picture from the geocultural framework, you can easily find that it all started with the Shanghai in 1930s and 1920s. And 1950s and 60s, the Tokyo or Kyoto were the place where most of the Asian cinema was produced and famous. And then during 1970s, with the launching of television in our household, Hong Kong and Taipei became the center of cultural product. And then it goes to the Beijing in 1990s. So it's a state-sponsored cultural products are very much prevalent in 1990s, and there was a fifth or sixth generation filmmakers appear during 1990s in Beijing, and with the the East Asian flow of the cinematic movement. And right now, I think that Seoul is the center of this kind of East Asian cultural and cinematic flows. So throughout the whole region and this 19th century, there is two kind of tensions between these two flows. There's the continental flows that circles around the Shanghai, Guangzhou, Hong Kong, and to Taiwan. And there's also maritime flow that always influence, confront with this continental flow, which is upheld by the United States and Japan, and to Taiwan. So I would like to oppose these two flows as a China circuit and a Japan line. So and there is also Sinophone cultural flow that start from Taiwan to Philippines and Southeast Asian countries. And there is also the Sino script, Chinese letters, which is right now, used in East Asian countries. So this is kind of bifurcation is very much important because it does not follow the geopolitical framework. So I'd like to term these two kind of opposing cultural strata or cultural axis as including these two opposing trend into one a basic structure of East Asian cinema, and I call it the East Asian cinematic infrastructure. So geographically, you see that there's a Shanghai and Hong Kong and Taiwan. This three axis circles around the South China Sea, and whereas this East China Sea circles circuit is made of Hollywood, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. So these two cultural flows consist of East Asian cinema infrastructure, and it goes hand in hand sometimes, but sometimes they clash with each other. Like Sino-Japanese War during 1937 and 1945, there was a big clash between China and Japan, and after that, these two cultural flows just separate each other and goes their own way, separate ways. So at least 1945, since 1945, these two trends just go separate way Uh, but I think that these two trends in 1980s converge in Taiwan. And that's what made possible Taiwan new cinema. This is my whole idea of this lecture. So I find that there's three important coordinates or strata that defines this East Asian cinematic infrastructure. And the one is that there is a still this East Asian region is still have trouble to cope with this post or coloniality that was inherited by imperialism by Western countries or Japanese empire. So post-coloniality is the basic quality that defines this region. And despite the end of the Cold War, there's still that there was a legacy of the Cold War, like communist or capitalist or free world is always antagonistic with each other. During the Cold War, it was Russia and China, but right now it's China, mainland China, and the United States and Japan, and there's a political antagonism still going on. And Taiwan society and other East Asian or Southeast Asian society still suffers from the remnant of the Cold War legacy. But most important, I think that the East Asian region is also defined by the cultural hybridity. Jameson talks about this cultural hybridity as kind of peripheral modernity, which is completely different from the first world modernity or the colonial modernity. As Jameson said, that this is a synchronous, the nomadic, simultaneity. So cultural hybridity. There's when you see the Southeast Asian countries or East Asian countries, there's always mixed cultural mixture between among these regions. There's a religious way or a cultural way or even linguistic way. There is a cultural hybrid is very much apparent in this region. So so taking these three coordinates as my starting point, I'd like to talk about the what is the importance of East Asian cinematic infrastructure uh, in analyzing the Taiwanese new cinema. So the Taiwan new cinema is for me is a kind of product or result of this Taiwan convergence. There was uh, um, as you know that during 1960s and 70s there was a uh, cultural cooperation between Hong Kong and Taiwan, and as you see that in 1960s and 70s most of the product that consumed Southeast Asian countries, very much coming from the Hong Kong and Taiwan. And so there was a historical partnership with Hong Kong and Taiwan. So if you divide this Hong Kong and Taiwan partnership, the Hong Kong is very much like a popular trend. And whereas Taiwan is much more a highbrow cultural product. Uh, so these two poles of the continental flow with Hong Kong and Taiwan, especially during 1960s and 70s, pushes this cultural flow and cultural, the strength into Taiwan, and Taiwan made possible this kind of flowering of new cinematic movement. And Taiwan is also the center of the Sinophone cultural heritages. This is very ironical because since 1945, mainly China was included in the Soviet bloc And in a cultural way, mainland China just disappeared almost 30 years out of this East Asian region or world pictures. They're just they just self-contained communist bloc, which does not have any cultural interest in inheriting its Sinophone cultural heritage. But Taiwan is the center that still keeps on um, holding this the connection with the Sinophone cultural heritages. Um, so it's and the Taiwan is relatively free from the confrontation between communist China and Western Japan. So even during the Cold War, Taiwan is not actually belong to either of these two blocks. They are separate, not independent, but they are not belong to these to either of these two countries, two blocks. And after 1970s, when you enter the 1980s, Taiwan society entered into this economic boom. And this is unprecedented, like Korea and Singapore and Hong Kong. Taiwan suddenly becomes the center of economic leaders in the East Asian region. And then there was a political liberation in 1987. As you know, that there was a repeal of martial law in Taiwan, which means that they can have the free election after that. So politically and economically, 1980s witnessed that Taiwan is the country that uh, you know uh, effectively shows force their potential of peripheral modernity. And into the bargain, you see that Taiwan new cinema was made possible, ironically, by the state's sponsorship, which is very much strong sponsors that support the national Taiwan cinema. And most of the directors that read the Taiwan new cinema also come from this state sponsorship motion picture system. This state sponsored motion picture system is as kind of Taiwanese version of the studio system that was very much popular in Japan 1960s and 50s and Hong Kong in 1970s. So commercial studio system is the model that the Hong Kong and Japan takes after from the Hollywood, but in Taiwan, this commercial studio system was replaced by the national and state-sponsored the motion picture system, which is very much supportive of the production of Taiwanese cinema. So Taiwan, during 1980s, becomes a compressed site of the East Asian political legacy, post-colonial legacy, and political confrontation, as well as cultural hybridity. That's what I term that this Taiwan new cinema as a minor cinema. Yeah. This coincide with the collapse of Hong Kong cinema in the 1970s. You know that the Hong Kong martial arts films in the 1970s is very much popular in the East Asian regions as well as United States. You do remember you instant remember that Bruce Lee was the leading character that introduced Hong Kong martial arts films into the United household. So there was a boom that this popular cinema of Hong Kong becomes a world cinema in a popular way. But this Hong Kong cinema is full of mannerism and genre conventions, and targeting mostly the working class families of the American subculture. So the Hong Kong cinema easily gave way to the home video culture of the 1980s and Hollywood blockbusters. So Hong Kong was very potential during the 1970s to become world cinema, but it's just defeated with the Hollywood blockbusters. But whereas Taiwan new cinema is, uh, suddenly emerges as a new center of East Asian cinema. So what I call the East Asian cinematic infrastructure or cinematic plane is it is intra-regional convergence of the two flows that was prevalent in China, mainland China, and Japan. So in some sense, Taiwan New Wave, recalls the first positive convergence of the two East Asian cinematic circuit after the initial clash in Shanghai during the 1930s. It was the conjunction or the recombination of three persistent strata of the East Asian cinematic plane: the persistent legacy of post-colonial trauma, the return of political confrontation due to China's emergence as a communist nation, and the vital cultural hybridity against the invasion of the post-modern globalization of Hollywood popular cinemas. Yeah. So in terms of this kind of specificity of Taiwan cinema, I'd like to call it as a minor cinema, borrowing the terms from Gilles Deleuze's idea of minor literature. So this minor cinema has, at least five features that concerns with the cinematic feature. One is that it's almost, always take interest in social minorities, and it also take interest in national minorities as well as cultural or regional minorities. And in every nation, this minor cinema also concerns with non-national minorities as well as cinematic minorities. So I would like to call this minor cinema as a cinema of peripheral minorities, and it is really has good example in Taiwanese cinema. So in Taiwan, the compressed peripheral modernity and rapid urbanization, together with high expectations of escape, if not freedom from the repressive ideological politics and residual coloniality, provided a rare combination or conjunction for cinematic creativity. So the Taiwan New Wave is the outcome of this historical convergence of the two circuits, resulting in the strange aesthetic hybridity in which the vernacular modernism of Shanghai, the transcendental and melodramatic styles of Japanese drama, the postmodern urbanity of Hong Kong films, and Taiwanese peripheral modernism. It's all mixed up in the unprecedented explosion of distinctive minor cinema. So I'd like to close my lecture briefly talking about the time images of Taiwan. Yeah. You know what the concept time images is, Gilles Deleuze's book on cinema, and he talks about the these time images is clearly different from the movement images that were very much prevalent in the Western cinemas. So though full of Taiwan's landscapes and seascapes with distinctive local images and sentiment, The films of Hou Xiaoxian and Edward Yang do not promote something positively identifiable as Taiwanese. You know, when you see the Taiwanese films in the 1980s, you see that this is distinctively coming from Taiwan. But you know, when you say that what is Taiwanese in the cinema, you cannot, you know, distinctly pinpoint what is Taiwanese in the cinema. So it is as if all the cinematic images were not imaginable elsewhere, but none of them could be labeled exclusively Taiwanese. You see that this comes from exclusively from Taiwan, but at the same time, you know that the same scene can be found somewhere else. So it's not, you know, belong to exclusively Taiwan. The deep intimacy and the universal appeal of these films precisely lie in this amorphous locality, representative of the East Asian peripheral modernity. Yeah, I would like to call it amorphous locality. You cannot pinpoint, you cannot, you know, exactly define what is this locality, what is Taiwanese identity. So it's just amorphous, it's without any shape, but it's the distinctive feature of East Asian peripheral modernity. The structural feeling, as it were, in these films fundamentally concerns the sentiment of post-colonial or peripheral minorities, which means the ethnic and social minorities of Taiwan society, cultural minorities of Taiwan history, regional minorities of East Asian community, as well as Southeast Asian culture community, or colonial minorities of imperial powers, ideological minorities of the Cold War, and hybrid minorities of postmodern multiculturalism. So the time images in these films are cultural signs, designating the hitherto unthematized history from the below, representative of the anonymous toils and sufferings of the minorities in East and Southeast Asia. Yeah, this is what I focus on the Taiwanese new cinema, the time images that is clearly distinct from the movement image, the linear images that depict the modernity and the transformation of all kind of modern cultural phenomena. And when you see the this the distinctive Taiwan new cinema, and you especially in the Hao Shaoxian and Yang, you can find that they are engaged themselves with the breaking up of the continuity principle of movement images. Yeah, it's very much a distinct feature, the breaking up of the continuity principle of movement images. You know, in case of Hou Xiaoxian, he resists the time frame of movement images by unexpectedly prolonging the cinematic durée. Yeah, his cinematic devices, predominantly defined by this long shot and prolonged time images that dominate in this movie. And Edward Young deconstruct the narrative continuity of movement images with frequent nonsensical interruptions, repeated time loops, and nonlinear juxtapositions of desperate mise-en-scène. For me, they defy montage aesthetics of classic cinema. The effect of these disruptions of classic cinematic temporality does not aim at the collapse of cinematic fantasy. What is invoked is rather the uncanny air of reality in this depthless everydayness, a fantasy of realism that there is nothing more or nothing less than what is being given on the screen at every moment. So the effects of the whole image, time image, is very much deep and profound, something very profound and unfathomable. But ironically, this is not made from some kind of deep structures or hidden structures, but it's always apparent in the surface as a kind of depthless everydayness, which is linked to Jameson's idea of peripheral modernity. For example, and you see the Hou Xiaoxian's 1989 movie, A City of Sadness, you see uh, the this kind of scenes frequently in his movies, as a Bijang Sen. When you see the left one, you said that it's called, you know, September 18 is a caption. There's a, you know, small family gatherings celebrating their own survival, and the lights, you know, illuminate these four people that, you know, confronting us audience, and there was this shadow of people coming and going, you know, frequently without any interruption. And the very next moment, when you see that these people with his, you know, the back turned toward the audience is very much, you know, is out of this cinematic grammar. But it's a very much interesting scene. So yeah, so my analysis of this scene is like this. You know, the house images have nothing to do with the creation of temporal status or slowing down of movement images, which foreground the fleeting reality of signified object. His cinematic world exclusively concerns with virtuality, or what Lucy calls agrammaticality. So it's, you know, constantly out of the cinematic grammar that was popular in Western countries, which ultimately contributes to the contingent emergence of the singular difference of each and every time image depicted. So the whole scene involves no preconceived philosophical or tragic idea what everydayness is. The distance of observation does not mean unaffected neutral perspectivism. The so-called precision staging at the dinner table, like this one, loops in a city of sadness could not be the result of Oji, you know, the Oji Yashiro, like deliberate reversal of cinematic continuity in montage perspectivism, but it's the outcome of intensively engaged gaze of the virtual otherness. The empty space in the middle, you know, on the right frame, you see that there's empty space. This the empty space in the middle renders people at the dinner table deforegrounded, as it were, as if they are seen by the virtual eyes of the disappeared, the missing people who have been intimately their people. So the perspective from the audience is coincides with the gaze of the people who is missing from this table. The dark human silhouette behind the bright table is starkly contrasted with empty space behind the screen table. The man with his back turned toward the audience disrupts the cinematic rule, only to obscure the vigilance of the party table. The viewer's gaze then falls on the empty spot, which was occupied by the dark human figure. The whole scene depicts the uncanny reality in which the dead people legitimately share the party table. Such is the virtual image framing of time images, singularly discernible only in the films of Taiwan New Wave and their quintessential East Asian scenescapes. So, so, um, so more detailed idea of how the films and, you know, each individual films and how this general feature of East Asian cinematic infrastructure. I would like to conclude here today and hope to continue our discussion after a week. So my conclusion is that Taiwan New Wave is the product of the geographical convergence of two distinctive East Asian cinematic circuits in the wake of rapid globalization. The Shanghai, Hong Kong, Taiwan axis of xenoscript continental diaspora and the Hollywood Tokyo Taiwan axis of maritime modernity converged in Taipei during the 1980s, which resulted in the unprecedented flowering of East Asian minor cinema that counts on the convergence of the tripartite strata of post-coloniality, political confrontation, and cultural hybridity. The East Asian cinematic plane or infrastructure thus revolves around the potentiality of minor cinema, whose signature time images are firmly grounded in the radical potentiality of peripheral remapping of existing world system. In this sense, Taiwan's new cinema coincides with the birth of the idea of world cinema as the minor cinema in the global south in its resistant confrontation with the myths of Hollywood principle of cinematic logic and continuity. So thanks for uh, listening to my lecture and hope to see you in a week in person.
Thank you, Professor Kang, for your lecture. And after that very enlightening lecture, may we now call or hear from our reactor or respondent, Professor David.
Okay. Good day to everyone. Like like Professor Kang, I would like to acknowledge the immense impact being made on cultural discourse by UNITAS, led by its editor, Professor Lulu Torres Reyes. I've been privileged to have known her for several decades when we were both film enthusiasts who showed up at private screenings and engaged in discussions afterward. Her willingness to allow the journals she edited, first Critica Cultura and now Unitas, to provide coverage in film and popular culture were crucial to my personal development as critic and scholar. I can state categorically that if not for her, I would be a far less accomplished and distinguished presence in the field. I was glad to be invited to respond to Professor Kang's lecture because I found answers to questions about Taiwan cinema that I had pushed to the back of my mind for future consideration, as it were. I remember during my graduate school years in the 1990s, my classmates and I would watch films from various centers outside of the usual Euro American spheres, since we were studying those types of films in our
Site the
classes anyway. Taiwanese cinema was starting to make inroads in festivals and art house screenings. During a survey of film critics for the most influential filmmaker of the decade, the Village Voice and Film Comment publications announced that their top notcher was Ho Xiaoshen. Yet, our personal and admittedly subjective preferences did not square with the experts' judgments. We would watch some of the better received titles by Howe and Edward Young, then switch to melodramas from Hong Kong and musicals from Bollywood. I guess this was a response to the prescriptions of film experts of an earlier generation who insisted on upholding art cinema, in line with the insistence of authors like Gilles Deleuze that classical Hollywood represented an ideal that deserved to be challenged and decimated. In fact, classical Hollywood was a few decades gone already by then. Our orientation was shaped more productively by scholars working in race and gender politics, who recommended that we take a closer look at works that inspired popular acceptance. This is why the lectures find Professor Kang's lectures finding that the Taiwanese new cinema was unable to sustain itself because of a lack of popular support from the audience makes total sense to me. When young filmmaking enthusiasts from the Philippines, for example, insist that their goal is to replicate the achievement of the French Nouvelle Vague, I have to keep reminding them that those products were highly influential, spreading through an entire continent and crossing an ocean to eventually challenge and defeat classical Hollywood because they were able to prove profitable in the first place. I have the impression that the lecture is meant to provide a framework that would be useful for more intensive readings of a number of crucial participants in Taiwanese and East Asian cinema, including Hao and Yang, as already mentioned. I would like to bring up a few considerations, if that's all right. First is the liminality of the position of Taiwan as an East Asian country. From what I understand, Taiwan was the country that was relatively least traumatized by the Japanese occupation. This derived from the Japanese government's avowal to prove their benevolence as colonizers in Taiwan, since Korean resistance was comparatively uncompromising, as it should be. A similar situation obtained in Taiwan's next door or next shore neighbor, the Philippines. The US was aware of European countries' skepticism toward its decision to join the colonizers' club after making a big show of rejecting its own colonizer barely over a century earlier at that time. Hence, it used the term benevolent in naming its expansionist projects, specifically the astounding oxymoronic term benevolent assimilation.
Mhm.
In practice, though, it made sure to provide the country, the Philippines, with several opportunities, including a qualified type of freedom of expression, which the other colonizing powers failed to bestow on the country's neighbors. This is the reason why, after World War II, no other countries welcomed the departure of the Japanese, as Korea, of course, and the Philippines, which was also the only country in the region that gladly welcomed back its Western colonizer. This places Philippines and Taiwan in contrasting positions regarding their respective occupation forces, where the Filipinos remained pro American, even swinging back to the US after a few years of welcoming China on the initiative of the incumbent president. Taiwan seems to prefer to cast its lot with Japan as a way of preempting prospective mainland encroachment. If we therefore regard the Western sphere of influence as consisting of the US and its promotion of so called American values, we can see that the region it configures in our part of the world is not just East Asia, but the Far East. Even with an independent scholar like Frederick Jameson surveilling representations outside the US and insisting on categorizing Taiwan as third world, he ends his volume by talking about the Philippines in what has turned out to be the geopolitical aesthetics most controversial chapter. He not only wound up debating Ahmad over the issue of essentializing third world cultural products by claiming that they all lent themselves to political allegorizing. He also incurred the hostility of a long list of progressive Philippine scholars who not surprisingly took Ahmad's side against Jameson's difficult and possibly unwinnable position. In contrast with this more carefully considered reading of Edward Young's Terrorizers in his chapter on what he termed the Taiwanese New Wave, Jameson also launched into a valorization of a movie that won a Critics' Prize at the Berlin International Film Festival, and that was picked up for distribution by Francis Ford Coppola's film outfit. The fact that Perfume Nightmare and its filmmaker's succeeding movies never found mass patronage in the home country, the Philippines, should have given him pause. But like Deleuze, his focus on aesthetic ideology must have sounded urgent and separable from social and demographic concerns. Hence, my notion of the kind of cinema that has taken shape in the region where I live and work is necessarily Eastern in the sense of Asia originally being defined as the Orient. Korean popular culture is, in fact, the element that makes this formulation possible when we find how it has virtually displaced Hong Kong influence in Southeast Asia, as also mentioned by Professor Kang. The handle that the lecture provided on approaching the cinema of Taiwan will become increasingly significant as China continues to assert its presence in the region. I also look forward to reformulations of national cinema concepts the way that Professor Kang has provided, more interregional, as well as a continuing attempt at inspecting and redefining the boundaries of what constitutes a vital and distinctive area of study. And that's it. I had more comments than questions.
Professor
I'm
Kang,
done.
any response to that? More of a remark than a question of Professor Joel David.
Yeah, thanks very much for the kindly comments and suggestions for my lecture. For me, I was just trying to figure out this micro cultural framework in order to look into the Taiwan cinema as well as the East Asian cinematic history. But your suggestion that there's is quite different experience of coloniality was going on in Philippines and Korea and Taiwan is really interesting suggestions and unfortunately I could not delve into the what's going on in Philippines now, and I saw this is several films of the Philippine directors, but I'm not has no comprehensive theory to include Philippine cinema as good part of this East Asian cinematic movement. But I think that the look into the Taiwanese situation might help to further investigate the significance of Philippine and including Southeast Asian cinema as well as the East Asian cinema and things like that. So, but Taiwan is the purple body, which is not identical with. Oh yeah. Okay. So in terms of Taiwan's political situation and cultural situation, there is a you can conceptualize Taiwanese cultural or cinematic situation in terms of Frederick Jameson's idea of peripheral modernity or third worldness or things like that. But for me, it's not just just the case of Taiwan, but other countries like Korea and Thai or Thailand or Philippines and any other countries, especially in East Asian regions. So any national cinema cannot be defined wholly in terms of national characteristics. That's my starting point, and I think that Taiwan showcases this excellent example of why the national framework or a national characteristics explanation of the specific national cinema could not be exhausted, because when you think about the East Asian cinema in terms of national cinema, you immediately has to consider this contextual framework that any national cinema has to be in cultural way interconnected with other countries and and what I call the East Asian cinematic plane or strata, because these countries all share some of the the three characteristics that I define as the coordinates of this East Asian, playing, the coloniality or a political confrontation and cultural hybridity. Japan and China, or sometimes they play the role of not a colonize the people, but the colonizers. But China has experience of colonizing as well as being colonized. Japan has no experience being colonized, but
Mhm.
you know in the situation like this, they are heavily dependent on the United States political way and economical way. But Taiwan and Philippines and Korea, South Korea, they all experience the same, colonial occupation and severe Japanese imperialism, and they are the victims of political confrontation of the Cold War, as well as these countries are not internally domestic way culturally hybrid, but they are also regionally culturally hybrid. You know, in case of Taiwan, they are the starting point of the uppermost point of Southeast Asian circle, which included lots of islands in the Southeast Asia, South China Sea, and and also Taiwan has this other feature that connect with East Asian Zionist script culture, like Japan, China, and Korea. These three countries are relatively non-hybrid cultures. They had their own national cultures, but in terms of the cultural context, these three countries also has to be involved with this kind of cultural hybridity by way of belonging to this East Asian cultural territories. So my so what I'm thinking about is that Taiwan is the this kind of a good example that think about how this national cinemas also involves with the always this regional and peculiar regional politics and cultures in the East Asia. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say in my lecture, and um, so, so Taiwan is so politically right now is very pro-American, and but in national way they are pro China and pro Americans that really has in conflict. And then toward the Japan, they has also has this ambivalent type feelings. Not relatively sad. You say Taiwan is more benevolent to the Japanese culture because they think that mainland China or the anti-communist regiment of Kuomintang is much more severe or violent toward the people rather than Japanese imperial power. But um, deep down in the Taiwanese culture, there is the native cultures and people in the original inhabitants. They are severely repressed and oppressed by the Japanese Empire, and then historical way more than more people, more soldiers were dead. Japanese soldiers were dead in the battle with Taiwan rather than in Korea. So there was a severe, historical trauma in Taiwan, and I think that I don't think Edward Young is really, has this deep historical sense of what was going on in Taiwan, but at least Hao Xiaoxian shows in his films that this complex historical ambivalent feelings toward the foreign forces and toward their own inferior status and things like that. So I think that's the very interesting term.
Thank you again, Professor Woosung Kang, and for the reaction and remarks of Sir Joel David. may we now proceed with the open forum now, the question and answer from our audience. The floor is now open for your questions to our
Mhm.
dear audience. And to start that, we have an anonymous question from a
Mhm.
participant. Okay, the
Right.
question for Professor Usung Kang: in a recent published article in Al Jazeera, Professor Thomas Barker was quoted to have said that horror films, which is an emerging or perhaps even a revived genre of film, is thriving in the Asian cinematic scene.
Mhm. Mhm.
Okay? While it is a stale type in the Western scene. Based on your observation, why do Asian horror films have
Mhm.
successfully marketed themselves in the silver screen compared to Western horror flicks these days? Or, in other words, what makes Asian horror sellable to the viewing public? And if I may just add, even in the online platform, there is a surge of Asian horrors as well in Netflix and
Mhm.
other streaming services.
Yeah, yeah. I think this is very interesting question, and yeah, I thought about it some time. The why, including the K cinema and any other East Asian boom in the Western countries. So why specifically these horror films are popular among Western viewers? Um, I think that there's for me there's two points that I have to take refer to. The one is that from the why Western viewers
Yep.
prefer Asian horrors rather than the Western horror series like zombies and Draculas and vampires and things like that. One is that it's relatively easy to explain that so it's what I called this Orientalist uncanny. The uncanny, the concept that some specifically are the familiar things that happening in the unfamiliar things that happening in the familiar situation gives you the chill and the horror. But the Western viewers would like to see something exotic and something unexpected and something mystical way feel or accept these Asian horrors as this new kind of uncanny that they quite different from that they experience in their own cultures. So when you look into the Western horrors like vampire or Dracula and series, there is this conceptual framework. The whole the whole movies of horrors in Western countries, skeptically said that schematically said that you can find this the whole framework of good and bad. And when you go into these horror films in the Western countries, how you instantly feel that you are in a position of being chased, being horrified. But at the same time you feel that you are on the good side. These guys are always bad, and they have to be crushed. And this some kind of passion, the pattern that you could enjoy as Western viewers. But it stales out. But when you see the Asian horrors, there is no boundary between what is good and what is bad, and there is something unseen and something seen. There is this kind of indistinction between these two realms. So they start to feel that the Asian things are really something new and something different from Western countries. But I don't think that this is really new kind of feeling, but it's a kind of repetition of what they think of an Oriental and Asian, and they project this kind of Orientalist idea of what Asian, cinema and what Asian culture is into what they are viewing. So that's what I call the Orientalist uncanny. And the other thing is that there is a really new and different feature in these Asian horror movies, which is I think that is they don't follow this kind of the Western horror film logics and grammars. For example, uh, I'm not sure, but if you saw this Korean movie that was really popular several years ago, this is called Train to Busan. It's a zombie movie. It's a big hit in Korea and as well as other countries. When you see this movie, there's a full of zombies and it has all kind of horror movie patterns, but when you see into the movie, you immediately feel that the zombies are really different from the Western zombies. Western zombies are really slow and they keep coming and they're really threatening to become a part of their everyday lives, threat. But in this film, you see that the zombies are really fast and they're really resilient and they are mechanically keep coming onto your spaces and they're really threatening, but at the same time these zombies has some kind of humanistic features within themselves. It's not just the thing that we have to abolish and eliminate. It's there's the good people or people without any kind of distinction always turns into these zombies. So there is a not clear distinction between zombies and humans. So this kind of features showcases how the Asian horrors really has something new kind of cinematic grammar and unexpected and illogical for some way, and so they just defy the filmic conventions that was prevalent in Western countries. That's my idea that how these Asian horror films are really popular in Western countries, but as well as in Asian countries also.
Yeah, maybe the main difference is that the Asian horrors are playing their strengths culturally. They're not
Yeah.
replicating the context of Western horrors.
Yeah.
Like what you've mentioned in Western horrors, most likely it's bad versus evil, and the protagonist is most likely the good one, antagonist is
Hmm.
the bad one. But in Asian horrors, sometimes even the protagonist is the bad person, the murderer.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then, the Asian audience, audience when you see this, Asian horrors, sometimes you are sympathize with the, zombies or horror figures rather than the good one, the victim of this situation. That's really peculiar about it.
I, even your pronunciation of zombies, there's a different genres of zombies, a Korean
Yeah.
zombies. They even coined it as zombies. As even outside Korea, they also term it as zombies. If it's a Korean zombie film, then it's zombie.
Yeah, we call it K zombie.
K zombie, yeah.
Yeah, there's a recent drama called Kingdom. It is a series of drama in Korea. You can see it in Netflix, right? Is a zombie that in ancient dynasty, and there was this kind of tradition of horror films in Korea, and it connects with zombie ideas, and it's so when you see this Kingdom and Train to Busan, the zombie is not just this foreign heterogeneous creatures, but it's the another face or an aspect of what you experience as you as an individual being you can also anytime can be a zombie. And you, so in this situation you have to sometimes sympathize more with these zombies, and then try to understand the history on the victimization of these zombies, rather than it's crushing and eliminating the zombie figures.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Professor Uso. I just have one personal query. This is a personal
Okay.
query because I've just recently read an article of a
Hmm.
scholar, another scholar, if I may add, declaring
Hmm.
the end of the cinema era.
Hmm.
More and more scholars are declaring the end of an era of the of a cinema movement, even saying that it actually enjoyed a longer term of an era compared to other art forms. But in a Oriental or Asian context, is that also true? That the cinema is also uh, it's not actually ending. It's already ended,
Hmm.
self-declared.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
has it ended here?
I'm not sure, but when you look back into the this not short history of East Asian cinema, when the this East Asian cinematic circuit has to be flowered in a specific country, the several conditions has to be met. Like as you see, the screen and the film industries is heavily dependent of the capital. So there has to be some kind of the money to support this industry as well as the audience. In case of Taiwan, this is, the box office is predominantly Hollywood movies, and there's no um, not significant movement of box office hit in Taiwan of domestic production. So in terms of consumption of the movie, it's domestic markets are still proliferating, but the lots of um, Asian countries are dominated by the Hollywood industry. But I'm not sure that in case of Korea, we have this kind of strong cultural resistance against this Hollywood encroachment of our cultural product. And then the crucial point is the audience. Lots of audience are really going into the theater and sponsored and support the national cinema, but not just the national cinema. They are really supportive when the good movie was turned out. They cannot distinguish between what is foreign and what is domestic. That's really good point. But unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic about the future of Asian cinema, because this the three characters that I mentioned the East Asian cinema stays still persistent, but and right now this global capitalism is so prevalently grip us to our feelings and how we think and how we act. So I'm not sure whether it's a regional frame or a national frame. In the Asian cinema has not that bright future. And the part of problem is that within this East Asian or in Asian region, there is no interconnected consumption of this mutual movies. Like Japanese movies are just right now that they are just insignificant right now. But lots of Japanese directors are find the market in Korean culture, as well as Apichatpong and Wirasateko, which is a famous Thailand director. He's also has no national background, and he just always get help from this outside of the national boundaries. So in a political way, we are not very favorable in situation, as well as especially in the time of pandemic. Even the movie going experience is very limited. Yeah. So maybe Netflix
Maybe
can be a
Netflix, yes, and
new
other streaming device.
new place to meet. But um, so one of the most good, important thing is to organize some kind of the inter-regional connections, like when you go into Busan International Film Festival, or Taiwan Film Festival. It has to be not just international, but it has to be inter-regional. It has to be more focused on the East Asian or Southeast Asian cinemas. Yeah. And
Yeah.
you have to find some kind of. I think Korea is right now very good place to converge this kind of Asian cinema, because we have lots of good infrastructures and a lot of good um, foundations. So just yeah, we Korean scholars or filmmakers in Korea, one way they try to be international in a Western and countries, and to be global, but we have this strong tradition of independent movies, and the movie makers and filmmakers are trained in this in independent area, and they move into the commercial films. So you have to come to Korea and make films, and talk about the films and East Asian cinema, and things like that. I
Thank
hope
you.
so.
Thank you, Professor, once again. Thank you, Professor Kang, Professor Joel David. Let me just yeah, turn on the camera.
Mhm.
Again, thank you to the both of you. We hope that you can also participate in other activities that we have lined up for the UNITAS 100 celebration. Because again, we
Mhm.
are celebrating the centennial
Mhm.
anniversary of UNITAS in 2022. Okay, thank
Mhm.
you once again. And that was Professor Kang and Professor David. May we now proceed to the next part of the program, the lecture of Professor Jeffrey Cabusao. Professor Cabusao's abstract reads, Who is Carlos Bolosan? Why is he significant? Why teach Bolosan in our classroom? These questions functions as a point of departure. By reviewing the significance of Carlos Bolosan, this lecture provides an opportunity to examine the continued relevance of Bolosan for the 21st century Filipino diaspora. A pioneering Filipino writer of the 20th century, Bolosan developed a unique transgressive aesthetic that travels across national and literary boundaries, and in the process reimagines the boundaries of Filipino identity and literary categorization. Emphasis will be placed on exploring approaches to teaching Bolosan as a transgressive 20th century Filipino writer in the 21st century classroom. Okay, but first, allow me to introduce our second pair of esteemed guests. Professor Jeffrey Cabusao, our esteemed guest speaker, is a professor in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at Bryant University, Smithfield, Rhode Island, USA. His teaching and research focus on U.S. ethnic studies, cultural studies, media literacy, and women's studies. He is the editor of Writer in Exile, or Writer in Revolt, Critical Perspectives on Carlos Bolosan, University Press of America, an imprint of Roman and Littlefield, 2016. In short, the talk's takeaway is this: By reviewing the significance of Carlos Bulosan, this talk provides an opportunity to examine the continued relevance of Bulosan as a transgressive 20th century writer for the 21st century diaspora. Mr. Victor Bautista, the respondent, is a faculty member of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at UP Diliman. In 2019, he received the Dr. Manuel D. Jr. Outstanding Thesis Award from the School of Humanities, Ateneo de Manila University, for his graduate thesis on Carlos Bulosan. The thesis is titled Contradictions in Late Bulosan, Politics, Subject, and Ethics in the Cry and the Dedication. His most recent publication is The Pervert's Guide to Historical Revisionism, Traversing the Marcos Fantasy, published by Philippine Studies, Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints in 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here's the lecture of Professor Cabusao.
Good evening. It's an honor for me to participate in the Unitas International Lecture Series, co-sponsored by Class and Critical Cultura. I'm grateful to Professor Lulu Reyes for the very kind invitation to join you today. The title of my talk is Carlos Bulosan and Filipino Collective Memory, Teaching, Transgression, and Transformation. Today, I'd like to talk a little bit about my upper division course in Asian American Studies, which I teach through the Department of English and Cultural Studies at Bryant University. In my course, I encourage students to reflect upon three interconnected strands: field formation, the history of the field of Asian American Studies; canon formation, the emergence of the category of Asian American literature; and racial formation, the construction of Asian American otherness and Asian American pan-ethnic identity. And we spend a considerable amount of time learning about a pioneering Filipino writer in the United States by the name of Carlos Bulosan. Born of the Filipino peasantry in Binalonan, Pangasinan in 1911, Bulosan arrived in Seattle, Washington in 1930. He joined 150,000 Filipino migrant workers in the canneries of Alaska and on the plantations of the US West Coast and Hawaii. Bulosan's racialized diasporic class consciousness, his understanding of his peasant origins, and his working class experiences informed his development as a prolific author of novels, short stories, essays, and poems. Bulosan died on September 11, 1956 in Seattle, Washington from pneumonia. I assigned Bulosan's Americas in the Heart, which was published in 1946. It was later recovered by the Asian American movement and republished in 1973 by the University of Washington Press with a reissue in 2014. It was recently released as a Penguin Classic in 2019. The text is very useful for me in the classroom because it helps my students make connections between the three strands of the course: field formation, canon formation, and racial formation, by introducing them to the Filipino-American experience and introducing them to a canonical text within Asian American Studies, a field that emerged out of the Asian American movement of the late 1960s. America is in the Heart is an ethnobiography divided into 4 parts and transgresses the literary conventions of various forms of writing, such as the Bildungsroman, naturalism, and proletarian literature. What we mean by ethnobiography is that our protagonist, Alos, is a composite of many stories. He embodies the collective experiences of the Filipino peasantry in the Philippines under American colonial occupation and Filipino migrant farm workers in the United States during the Great Depression. The structure of the ethnobiography traces the development of Alos's awareness of marginalization and his crafting modes of resistance as a writer activist of the Filipino-American labor movement, which includes the formation of the UCAPWA Union. UCAPWA stands for United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. When I teach Bulosan's Americas in the Heart, I ask students to situate the Filipino experience within US-Philippine colonial relations. I emphasize that American colonization is key to understanding the historical context of the narrative, its conflicts, and the development of its characters. Part 1 of Americas in the Heart dramatizes how the dissolution of Alos's family and their dispossession of land in the Philippines is due to absentee landlordism under American colonial occupation. And here's a passage from the text that explains what this looks like for our characters. One summer day, when the rice lay golden in the sun, startling rumors came to Mangusmana. The peasants in a province to the south of us had revolted against their landlords. There, the peasants had been the victims of ruthless exploitation for years, dating back to the 18th century, when Spanish colonizers instituted severe restrictive measures in order to impoverish the natives. So from then on, the peasants became poorer each year, and the landlords became richer at every harvest time. And the better part of it was that the landlord was always away, sometimes merely a name on a piece of paper. Asian American historian Erica Lee reminds us that US rule transformed the Philippine economy in ways that benefited American investors, but not Filipinos, expanding the Philippines' export-oriented economy, first established by the Spanish. To help students understand the impact of US colonization on the specificity of the Filipino experience, I introduced the concept of racial national subordination. And what this means is that within the text, the racism encountered by Filipinos in the Philippines and by Filipinos in the United States cannot be separated from the colonial status of the Philippines. Filipinos were classified as US nationals ineligible for citizenship and described in racial terms as uncivilized savages, brutal rapists, and even dogs and monkeys, or children in need of US guidance. So what this means, according to Bruce Osenya, is that Filipinos have been integrated into US society on the basis of inequality and subjected to discrimination due both to their race and nationality. I asked students to identify passages from the text that illustrate the racial national subordination that Filipinos encountered. And one of the passages that is useful for this exercise appears at the start of part 2 of the narrative. Part 2 begins with Alos's passage to America as a steerage passenger. A traumatic encounter with a young white girl on the boat's deck foreshadows Alos's life of fear and flight in the United States, where he eventually reconnects with his brothers Macario and Amado and learns to reconstitute family, community, and belonging through interracial working class solidarity. So here's the moment where Alos encounters a young white girl on the boat's deck. Look at those half-naked savages from the Philippines. Haven't they any decency? I was to hear that girl's voice in many ways afterward in the United States. It became no longer her voice, but an angry chorus shouting, "Why don't they ship those monkeys back where they came from?" I also asked students to consider how racial national subordination exacerbates the hostile working conditions of Filipino migrant workers. Our protagonist Alos bears witness to the inhumane working conditions of Filipino migrant workers. And here's one vivid example from the text of hostile working conditions in Alaska. In those days, labor unions were still unheard of in the canneries. So the contractors rapaciously exploited their workers. They had henchmen in every cannery who saw to it that every attempt at unionization was frustrated and the instigators of the idea punished. The companies also had their share in the exploitation. Our bunkhouses were unfit for human habitation. The lighting system was bad and dangerous to our eyes. And those working in the semi-darkness were severely affected by the strong ammonia from the machinery. I was working in the section called Wash Lie. One afternoon, a cutter above me, working in the poor light, slashed off his right arm with the cutting machine. It happened so swiftly he did not cry out. I saw his arm floating down the water among the fish heads. America is in the Heart was reclaimed by the Asian American movement of the late 1960s and the revitalized Philippine national sovereignty movement of the 1970s. And the text resonated with the liberatory visions of these mass movements for two reasons. One, the text documents the exploitation and oppression of Filipinos within racial capitalism. And two, the text documents Filipino collective agency. It traces Alos's development from racialized class awareness of marginality to the emergence of a diasporic Filipino protest consciousness. The openings of parts 3 and 4 are vastly different from the opening of part 2. They emphasize the development of the Filipino organic intellectual, Alos as a writer-activist. Part 3 opens with the publication of The New Tide, a Filipino workers' magazine. Part 4 opens with Alos reflecting upon American models of the writer-activists, such as Carrie McWilliams, Louis Adamek, and others. The narrative as a whole, however, reveals that Alos's ideal model of the writer-activist is rooted in diasporic Filipino insurgency, a concept embodied by the character of Felix Razon, whom Alos first encounters during his childhood in the Philippines. Felix Razon later reemerges within the narrative as an active participant in the Filipino labor movement in the United States. And here's Alos's encounter with Felix Razon in part 1 of the text. My mother and I went to the town of Tayog, a rich rice land, and helped in the harvest. Tayog and 2 other neighboring towns belonged to one family. In the middle of the season, strange men began coming to the rice fields. A rugged peasant boy made impassioned speeches to the harvesters. I remember this fanatical peasant boy because years afterward, I met him again in America. His name was Felix Razon. Years later, Alos reunites with Felix Razon in the United States. I took a bus for Los Angeles. I found that my brother Macario and Nick, Jose's brother, were living together. They had started a literary magazine with a man named Felix Razon. To my amazement, he was the same peasant boy who had warned me to leave the rice fields of Tayog before the Colorom revolted against the landlords. Felix Razon and the Tayog uprising of 1931 speak to a diasporic Filipino insurgency, or a global movement of anti-colonial Filipino protest consciousness. The development of Felix Razon's character in the narrative resonates with the life of Pedro Calosa. Pedro Calosa is the central organizer of the Colorom groups of the 1931 Tayog Revolt. Filipino historian Renato Constantino reminds us of the significance of Pedro Calosa in the Tayog Revolt. Galosa had spent many years as a laborer in the sugar fields of Hawaii, but plantation authorities dismissed him when they discovered he was attempting to organize his co-workers. Sent back to the Philippines, he finally settled in Pangasinan, where he worked in the rice fields. The Tayog Revolt was supposed to be the spark that would ignite the whole of central Luzon in a peasant revolution that would achieve independence for the country and reward all participants with equal shares in lands confiscated from caciques. Bulosan's dramatization of the diasporic continuity of anti-colonial Filipino protest consciousness helps to explain why America is in the Heart resonated with activists of the Asian American movement and the Philippine sovereignty movement into the 1980s. We can see how this diasporic continuity is represented in an early attempt by a Filipino-American filmmaker and activist to create a film inspired by Bulosan's America is in the Heart. In a moment, I'll play footage from an unfinished film titled Quiet Thunder from 1981. In this footage, filmmaker and activist Linda Mabalot portrays Filipino resistance to American colonization of the Philippines as the political unconscious of America is in the Heart. It's a reference to the Philippine-American War, which lasted between 1899 and 1902. This underlying historical memory of America is in the Heart resonated very deeply with Asian American and Filipino American activists of the 1970s and 1980s. And I'll now play footage from Quiet Thunder. This is about 6 minutes.
So, there we are. Me and my brother Pascual and 3 other Pinoy ride a taxi from San Francisco to San Luis Obispo and paid $120 for the trip. That was our first day in America. Do you know what we had to eat at our first meal in that town? No, ano? Pancake, magali pancake. That is because the only word that we know on the menu is pancake. Pancake, by God, pancake. So there we were, the 5 of us, eating pancake and syrup on a hot summer day. Do you know what? I do not even like pancakes. Hey, I know that one. Alam ko yan. Tarararan, tararan, tarararan, tararan, tarararara, tarararara, tarararara. Sige na! Tarararara, tarararara, tarara, tarararara, tarara, tarararara. Pancake! $120 for the trip. Pancake. I don't even like pancake. You look like pancake.
Yeah, it looks like a chicken. As a teacher, I realized that concepts such as US Philippines colonial history and racial national subordination might seem at times too abstract for students to grasp. So I use a theoretical spine of the field to help my students. And here I'm referring to the rearticulation of Orientalist discourse within the field of Asian American studies. The framework of American Orientalist discourse helps my students to grasp and visualize concepts specific to the Filipino experience. And when I tell my students we're looking at Orientalist discourse, what we're looking at is a motivated form of producing knowledge about Asia and its inhabitants. Asian American Studies scholar Gary Okihiro explains the concept of Orientalism for my students in the following. Orientalism composed a system of thought that supported a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over Asia. Orientalism's purpose was to stir an inert people, shape them, and give them an identity, and subdue and domesticate them. One of the invaluable teaching tools that I use is a book titled The Forbidden Book, The Philippine-American War in Political Cartoons. And here are a few images from that collection that I asked students to examine in the classroom. I asked them to walk me through how these images, as part of American Orientalist discourse, represent Filipino otherness, specifically the racial and national subordination of Filipinos. This image is titled The White Man's Burden, Apologies to Kipling, published in 1899. The image on the left is titled The Filipinos' First Bath, published 1899. The image to the right, titled Christmas in Our New Possessions, published in 1902. What my students are able to identify is the way in which these political cartoons portray Filipinos as brown-skinned children incapable of self-rule. When asking students to reflect upon American Orientalism, I encourage them to consider how Bulosan's text interrogates, destabilizes, and challenges American Orientalist discourse by bringing their attention to a deconstructive moment in part 1. Here, in an individual act of survival, Alos reveals Filipino racial otherness as a fiction. Alos's performance denaturalizes the American colonial gaze that objectifies, essentializes, and dehumanizes Filipinos. My clothes began to wear out. I was sick from eating what the traders discarded. One day, an American lady tourist asked me to undress before her camera and gave me 10 centavos for doing it. I had found a simple way to make a living. Whenever I saw a white person in the market with a camera, I made myself conspicuously ugly, hoping to earn 10 centavos. But what interested the tourists most were the naked Igorot women and their children. They seemed to take a particular delight in photographing young Igorot girls with large breasts and robust mountain men whose genitals were nearly exposed, their G-strings bulging large and alive. In the class, when we talk about American Orientalist discourse, I remind students that we're talking about a motivated form of knowledge produced by different types of texts, such as political cartoons, and in this case, a souvenir textile from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair that features images of the Bontoc Igorot people. Images that are framed by the American colonial gaze. This textile is part of the museum's collection. In this slide, a RISD artist fellow by the name of Walker Metling attempts to decode the images in the textile. As we can see, Metling is surprised to learn about American colonization of the Philippines at the turn of the century and how Filipinos were displayed as part of a human zoo in 1904 in the United States. And we see a little bit of Metling's writing here. Item number 9, he identifies the textile as a souvenir of the Philippine exhibit World's Fair, and he's very surprised. He says, "What?" Exclamation point, question mark, exclamation point. Early in the course, I have students read Asian American historian Ronald Takaki, who was interested in viewing Asian Americans as not merely victims of history, but also subjects of history, as women and men who have minds, wills, and voices, and the ability to resist victimization and to create history. The enduring appeal of America is in the Heart for the Field lies in its ability to reveal how Filipinos have been victimized by history, as well as how Filipinos have survived and collectively resisted. Called little brown brothers, barbaric yellow bellies, scarcely more than savages, and other derogatory epithets, Filipinos as subjects in revolt have refused to conform to the totalizing logic of white supremacy and the knowledge of the Filipino constructed by the orientalizing methods of American scholarship. Interpolated within the boundaries of empire, Filipinos continue to bear the marks of 3 centuries of anti-colonial insurgency. America is in the Heart is a text that, to borrow from Isan Juan Jr., bears the marks of anti-colonial Filipino insurgency, a history that informs the Filipino-American labor movement of the 1930s, a movement that paved the way for Filipino-American labor activists of the 1960s, such as Philip Veracruz and Larry Itliong. One of my writing prompts or writing assignments asked students to discuss how America is in the Heart speaks to Philip Veracruz's moral vision of compassion, solidarity, and commitment, which is explained by Asian American scholar activist Glenn Umatsu. Through his years of toil as a farm worker, Philip Veracruz recognized the importance of worker solidarity and militancy and the capacity of common people to create alternative institutions of grassroots power. Through his work with Filipino and Mexican immigrants, he saw the necessity of coalition building and worker unity that crossed ethnic and racial boundaries. Veracruz has also promoted a larger moral vision, compassion for all victims of oppression, solidarity with all fighting for liberation, and commitment to the ideals of democracy and social justice. One example from America is in the Heart that inspires my students and allows them to make a connection with Veracruz's moral vision of compassion, solidarity, and commitment is Alos's developing a worker school in California near the end of the text. I worked with a crew of pea pickers in Nipomo. I found a new release. The land had always been important to me. I felt my old peasant heritage returning with fresh nourishment. I knew that my future was linked with these tillers of the soil from whose common source I had sprung. I started a little worker school and invited the pea pickers. When I pointed out that the advance of democracy was related to the working man's struggle for better wages and living conditions, I felt a warm feeling of humanity growing inside of me. I left Nipomo for Bederavia, a town 15 miles away. In this little town, nestling like dried mushrooms, were Filipino and Mexican sugar beet workers. I worked with them and started another class. Bulosan's generation of Filipino migrant workers and labor organizers of the 1930s, whom we refer to as the Manongs, paved the way for the creation of the United Farm Workers Movement, which emerged through solidarity between Filipino and Mexican farm workers. This slide features an image of Larry Itliong, the president of the Filipino organization called Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee. Itliong bridged Bulosan's generation with the inter-ethnic farm workers movement of the 1960s. I'd like to close with a 6-minute clip from the recent PBS documentary on Asian Americans, which highlights, not unlike Bulosan's America's in the Heart, the contributions of Filipino farm workers. We begin with Larry Itliong in California's Central Valley.
Larry Itliong was president of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, known as AWOC. Summer of '65, he began to talk about organizing, improving the working conditions, increasing the salaries.
We feel that we farm workers should have an organization of our own.
One of the things that most people forget is that it was the Filipinos in September 1965 who started the grape strike, not the Mexicans.
The strike happened mainly because of Larry Itliong's will and determination. He was a trained labor leader. He was gruff. He was not a polished speaker.
I was 13 years old the day that my family went out on strike. I remember we were working when my father says, "Come on, we're leaving." I says, "We're leaving, it's 10 o'clock in the morning." So we left.
To go on strike, you suffer a lot of hardship. Maybe you get hungry, maybe you're gonna lose your car, maybe you're gonna lose your house.
And I remember leaving the field and driving through seeing the strikers of the Filipinos.
But the Filipinos face a dilemma. As they strike for a union, the farmers bring in Mexican workers to replace them.
It's one of the things I learned that the farmers like to do. They like to pit the Mexicans against the Filipinos because you're going to be fighting for the same pot of gold.
Many Mexican laborers have already joined the National Farm Workers Association, led by the charismatic Cesar Chavez.
I remember meeting at the Filipino Community Hall in Delano. And all the labor contractors were there, and a lot of the farm workers were there, and they're trying to decide, are we going to end the strike? Or are we going to negotiate with the Mexicans to join us? And then Larry Itliong, he gets up and says, I'm going to go talk to the Mexicans.
When the strike happened, Cesar Chavez wasn't really quite ready. But Cesar also knew that if they didn't join the Filipinos then they would never happen.
Larry approaches Cesar Chavez and his colleague Dolores Huerta, another powerful organizer.
Come on up, brothers, we are waiting for you.
As one of AWOC's co-founders, her relationship with Larry and the Filipinos goes back years.
And then a couple days later, we're at this church. They're talking about the strike. They're discussing, should we go on strike or not go on strike? And all of a sudden there's this swelga. I said, what the heck swelga? Because I thought they were saying, hell no. I said, no, it means strike, we're going on strike. And so the Mexicans joined us.
Where are your brothers and sisters over here? Come on! Come on now! ¡Viva la causa! ¡Viva!
They take the Mexican labor movement and the Filipino labor movement, they create the United Farm Workers.
When they really push that the workers eat together, they have meetings together, that they were on picket lines together. And it was only because of they become one union that they were able to win the strike.
Larry knew that his style was not good PR. He's aggressive. He wore his emotions on his sleeve. He needed Cesar's charisma, his ability to speak. Cesar was the spokesman.
It's going to be built by farm workers, and it's going to be for farm workers.
Whereas Larry wanted to get down and dirty. He wanted to work out in the fields.
Delano became more than a farm labor dispute. It became, in a sense, the West Coast civil rights movement for people of color. All of a sudden, people started equating what was happening in Delano to the black civil rights movement on the East Coast in Alabama and Mississippi. You started having these politicians coming out there. You have Robert Kennedy holding hearings as to why the white growers are not going to give people of color these benefits that they're asking for. Not only are you boycotting in Delano, now you're sending groups and college students and people who believe in a labor union and equal rights to do a secondary grape strike. And now they're boycotting in New York, they're boycotting in Montreal in Canada, they're boycotting in Europe, they're boycotting California grapes.
Strike and boycott against grapes will continue.
It took 5 years to finally get the growers to sign a contract. And that was only because people went out on the boycott and they convinced people all over the United States not to eat grapes. growers couldn't sell their products, and so they had to sign.
Larry Itliong, what do you have to say about seeing grapes at the stores after all this time?
Well, I think that it's great, and thanks to the co-op store that have been supporting the grape boycott to help bring about justice and dignity on behalf of the farm workers.
For me, that's one of my pride and joys. Yeah, Filipinos were here and we made a difference.
The end of the video clip ends with a very powerful and moving statement. Filipinos were here and we made a difference. And I'd like to end with a question. Today, Filipinos are everywhere, nearly 12 million around the globe. How can Bulosan help us to continue to make a difference in the 21st century? Thank you very much.
So that was Professor Cabusao. Thank you for your lecture. May we now hear from the respondent. Again, let's welcome Mr. Victor Bautista.
Professor Cabusao, for your lecture. On Carlos Bulosan was when I was writing my MA thesis, which was mentioned when the host was reading my bio note. I truly appreciate Professor Cabusao's comprehensive knowledge on Carlos Bulosan, as evinced by the fact that he was able to give this lecture, he was able to give so much context, the different ways that he could approach Carlos Bulosan, contextual, theoretical, pedagogical, and I deeply appreciate that. Since this talk, this lecture is about who is Carlos Bulosan, that's the very first question at the start.
I believe Victor is experiencing some connection issues. Victor, you're experiencing some connection difficulties. If you may just repeat that again.
Sorry about that. So, so as I was saying, I really appreciate the comprehensive knowledge that Professor Cabusao shares, has discovered about Carlos Bulosan, contextual, literary, theoretical, and of course, pedagogical. This is the object of the talk today, right? Who is Carlos Bulosan? How do we teach Carlos Bulosan in the classroom today? And what I would like to do is to ask two questions that help us pull Carlos Bulosan closer into the 21st century classroom, both in the United States and in the Philippines. So my first question concerns the essential political element of Carlos Bulosan's writing, and is about internal contradiction. Okay, so my first question is this: how do we teach the essential political element of Carlos Bulosan's transformation? These are words in Professor Cabusao's lecture itself.
Can you repeat that? There was a connection issue again.
Sorry.
Can you repeat that?
This connection issue. How do we teach the essential political element of Carlos Bulosan? Okay, so
and we lost you again. Sorry for that. We lost you again. Can you repeat that question?
Sorry about my connection issues. Okay, again. So the first question is, how do we teach the essential political element of Carlos Bulosan's writing in a transgressive way toward transformation? So the important term in this question is the essential political element. So just to elaborate, class and socialism are essential parts of Carlos Bulosan's writing. and even life, which teachers might ignore or whitewash. In the Philippines, this erasure might stem from the fear of red tagging. Red tagging refers to the way that the government can tag certain individuals, from journalists to athletes to educators, ordinary individuals being so-called communist, right? And red tagging has consequences from jailing up to death, right? However, if we don't discuss this political element in the Philippine classroom, students today lose the opportunity to interrogate and expand their already political consciousness. When they can't discuss the essential political aspects of Bulosan's writing in the classroom. So in the Philippine classroom, for instance, at least in the schools where I have taught, not only in UP Diliman, but also in one senior high school where I taught, students today have a more political consciousness. And this is something that Gina Apostol, who gave a talk earlier this week, also mentioned about her students in the United States. Now, moving on to an American context, in the United States, Amanda Solomon Amorao reports in her 2014 Critica Cultura article that Assembly Bill 123, quote, requires California public school curriculum to include the contributions of Filipino immigrants to the farm labor movement in the state. She surmises that this bill might lead to Carlos Bulosan becoming required reading in California classrooms. Actually, it might already be required reading, as shown by Professor Cabusao's teaching experience. Amorao warns, however, against a narrow teaching of Bulosan in classrooms. Quote, only motivated by a multicultural sense of inclusion in local, state, and larger national history would actually act against the radical potential of Bulosans and the Manong generation's labor activism and cultural work. End quote. What both the Philippine and American teachings of Bulosan have in common, it seems, is the aversion or the possible aversion toward the political in his writing and life.
Yeah.
Especially in the terms that Bulosan used himself. So again, how do we teach the essential political element of Carlos Bulosan's writing in a transgressive way toward transformation, given these contexts, when Bulosan himself, in one of his poems, cries aloud, "We are the revolution." So that's, I think, given my connectivity problems, we can start with the first question, and then I can move on to the second question about internal contradictions afterwards.
Thank you so much.
Reaction regarding
Okay. Sure. Okay. Can you hear me now, Francis? Okay. All right. I want to say thank you so much to Victor for his very thoughtful comments. I have to say, first of all, I'm very, very excited about this opportunity to meet with my colleagues in the Philippines and teachers in the Philippines on the topic of Bulosan and teaching Carlos Bulosan. And so I'm really interested in Victor's question about how do we teach the essential political element of Bulosan's writing in the Philippine classroom and also in the U.S. classroom, especially given the concern of red baiting or red tagging, which is also historically an issue in the United States. I think in terms of teaching Bulosan, the essential political element of Bulosan, perhaps in the Philippines, one way we can do that, let's say in America is in the Heart, is to encourage students to look at how Alos develops his class consciousness, right? How Alos develops his class consciousness as a way of confronting and perhaps the central issue that can be brought to the fore as a point of departure to talk about the essential political element, the progressive class politics of Bolosan is to ask students to think about Bolosan's work as a tool to confront colonial trauma. Because the class conflicts that Alos encounters in part 1 of America's in the Heart, right? There's a moment, Victor, you'll recall, where Alos is in the market with his mother, and he confronts the arrogant attitudes of the Philippine middle class, right? And so the class conflicts in the Philippines for Alos cannot be disconnected from the colonial history, right? And so maybe putting front and center colonial trauma, using Bolosan's text as a way of confronting colonial trauma, and then tracing his class consciousness. You know, how does Alos do that from the Philippines into his experiences in the United States, where he eventually becomes a labor organizer, fusing the history of the peasantry in the Philippines and their revolting against absentee landlordism, and connecting that with the struggles of Filipino migrant farm workers in the United States. He fuses those two traditions, right? And so, but also part 1 of America's in the Heart is very unique because, and I mentioned this in the presentation, the Tayog revolt. I mean, there's an anti-colonial dimension of that revolt, that peasant revolt. And so I think Bolosan can be very useful for students in the Philippines to re-engage Philippine history, particularly working class Filipino history. And I'm glad that you also brought up the question of how do we teach Bolosan the essential political element of Bolosan in the United States. And there's a way in which Bolosan's progressive vision can be watered down, or as you mentioned, I believe whitewashed by US multiculturalism. And here I turn to the work of E. San Juan Jr., and perhaps this can also address how do we teach Bolosan, not only in the US, but also in the Philippines. And as you know, San Juan is the world expert on Carlos Bolosan. And over the past several years, he's been talking about the project of decentering Bolosan studies. That what this means is that it's calling for a shift in paradigm, particularly shifting what he calls the immigrant assimilationist paradigm for teaching Bolosan. The immigrant assimilationist paradigm erases the radical politics of Bolosan, right? It obscures the US-Philippine colonial relations, which is the larger context for Filipino migration. And it sort of frames Bolosan's body of work in terms of it sort of distorts our vision of Bolosan as if he's writing to assimilate into the middle-class American dream, right? And so the decentering of Bolosan studies, according to E. San Juan, is that perhaps our point of departure could be the Cry and the Dedication, which Bolosan wrote in the 1950s about the Hukbalahap rebellion in the Philippines. And so, and I guess what I do in my classroom and teach in terms of teaching Bolosan, I have students focus on class consciousness and what does that mean for the character, and how does he develop that class consciousness when he moves, Alos, I'm talking about Americans in the Heart, when he moves to the United States and encounters racism there. And of course, his way of dealing with both colonial trauma and economic exploitation is interracial working class solidarity. So I hope that answers your question somewhat. But I'm happy to elaborate on any points.
Maybe I just want to what Professor Cabusao just elaborated on.
Yeah, go ahead, Victor.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, these are actually very, very helpful because as a professor in UP Diliman, it is possible that if I get there, I might be able to teach Carlos Bolosan in my own classes. And I think that what you said about just around the central question of asking students How does Alos develop his class consciousness, right? And I think it's also really, really helpful for you to mention of like how to deal with class trauma, because like a common way for students to get into what they're reading is to, of course, begin with like, okay, how does this relate to me? And I think that, you know, like with the economic suffering, you know, in the Philippines now, and like I see this with a lot of my students from working class backgrounds in the University of the Philippines, they're really economically suffering, right? So you know, when they see the parallel between their own class trauma from, you know, not having gadgets, like their house flooding, I think that this is a good it's an excellent gateway for students to draw something from Carlos Bolosan. As for the United States, I'm glad that you mentioned the cry and the dedication, because it's actually the subject of my thesis, and this perfectly transitions into my second question about contradiction, specifically internal contradiction. I wonder, Professor Cabusao, if you have any thoughts on how to teach students about failure, right? The failure of left movements in the 20th century. Because I guess we can start with the text first, right? Because in the cry and the dedication, so you have you also have an avatar for Carlos Bolosan, right? So if in America is in the Heart, you have Alos, who is the stand-in, the avatar for Carlos Bolosan. In the cry and the dedication, you have Dante, right? And what happens with Dante is that, you know, he migrates from the United States to the Philippines, and he becomes a propagandist for the armed movement, right? And it's very striking because it's the failure, it's it's the crushing of peaceful struggle, peaceful means, which leads Dante to joining the armed struggle, right? So so how can we teach and I guess I want to delve a little bit more here, because I grabbed my copy of my thesis. Because I think towards the end of his life, Carlos Bolosan kind of got disillusioned with unions. So in a letter that he sent to Sonora Bab in 1954, he, quote, expressed his disillusionment with some union leaders and officers who were vicious, cruel, power mad people. And he also quit the union, all right? And he further radicalized his politics, specifically with the armed struggle, right? And even the armed struggle, of course, has failed, right, in its objectives. And I want to go big before turning it back to you, Professor Cabusao, from text to context, right? Because, you know, going back to this point that students now, like they tend to be more political at a younger age. I think, like how can reading Carlos Bolosan make them grapple with failure, right? Because again, to go into context, I think in the United States, perhaps like a lot of your students and a lot of American students, they love Carlos Bolosan in the classroom, but they also support Bernie Sanders, right? And Bernie Sanders, like, he was just crushed by his own party, right? And that was very, very, very crushing for a lot of these young people, right? Like, they really support him. According to Natalie Wynn ContraPoints, this YouTuber, you know, a lot of Americans got into left politics because of Bernie Sanders, and they were like totally crushed by his defeat. So that's one defeat, that's one failure. And also in the Philippines right now, as the elections near, there's kind of a clash, right? Because on the one hand, people are becoming more and more disillusioned and angry at the state, but on the other hand, there's no end in sight, right? There seems to be a failure for a radical alternative to emerge and capture the imagination and trust of the people. So again, I want to go back to my question, like when we think of like how does Carlos Bolosan's life and writing give students the opportunity to think about failure, to think about internal contradiction in the classroom?
Yes. You know, that's a very excellent and very thoughtful question, Victor, and I'm glad that you asked that. I mean, you mentioned here in the U.S., you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and you know, even though he didn't win the presidential election, I think what is hopeful about Bernie Sanders is, and you mentioned this, and how he inspired so many young people. And then Bernie Sanders, came into the spotlight because of the existence of many social movements that are led by young people. Black Lives Matter, the movement for immigrant rights. And so, I always encourage young people in my class to remember or think about how it's always young people at the forefront of social justice movements, historically. Now, with regard to failure, I think with Bulosan, and I'm glad that you brought up the cry and the dedication, because when I first read that, and you mentioned Dante, I was disturbed with, of course, deeply disturbed with Dante's death. And then he was buried because Dante was the peasant worker, organic intellectual, right? He was a farm worker, migrant worker from the United States. He became an author. So he says, as you said, a stand-in for Bulosan. So he enabled Bulosan's return to the Philippines, which Bulosan was not able to do physically. However, there's that moment where he dies. He's killed by his brother. So that speaks to the the civil war in the Philippines. That's part of the colonial trauma. And then he's buried with his own book. And here I'm reminded of a very brilliant essay by a literary scholar, Timothy Libretti, who uses a psychoanalytic Marxist feminist approach to reading The Cry and the Dedication. And it's in the collection Writer in Exile, Writer in Revolt. And he reads Dante's death and his being buried with his book as a form of cultural delinking, that Bulosan is moving towards or suggesting a kind of cultural delinking from the West. In other words, Bulosan was searching for, or maybe, this is my interpretation, sort of his challenge to other Filipino artists and intellectuals to imagine ways of writing that actually speak to everyday people in the Philippines and in the United States and in the Filipino diaspora. Right. In the 1930s, Richard Wright wrote an essay called Blueprint for Negro Writing, which he encouraged African American writers, and this is in the midst of Jim Crow, of legal racial segregation in the United States. And he was encouraging African American writers to use their craft to speak directly to African Americans using the folklore, right? Using the music, using the tradition. That perhaps a new generation of Filipino artists and writers could use their craft that draws on the folklore, the oral traditions of storytelling, that speaks directly to the masses of Filipinos. And here I'm thinking of maybe more contemporary artists. And in the classroom, I would encourage maybe students to think of contemporary artists who do this. And I think of Ruby Ibarra, who is a Phil-Am hip-hop artist. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but in many ways she's following in Bulosan's footsteps. Or Charmaine Clamore, who is she created a genre called Jazzapino, and she uses the genre of Jazzapino to what she calls decolonize the song Dahil Sayo, because for so long that has been associated with the Marcos regime, and so so I think with Bulosan, that in the face of failure, I would encourage students to look at how he was able to sustain hope. I think it's because of his connection with the masses of working people in the Philippines and in the United States that gave him hope. But I think that's an excellent question, especially now at this historical moment.
I like your I really appreciate your response, Professor Cabusao, to my second question about failure, because and that there's a movement from failure to hope, and I think that in the cry and the dedication itself, it's manifest in the fact that even though Dante has died and the mission is impossible, right? It has to be aborted. The rest of his comrades, carry on into the new morning. And if I remember correctly, that's the final, that's the final phrase in the novel, the new morning, right? So I'm also because I think there's a turn to in left politics towards grappling with failure and accepting that failure is part of the risk of any struggle, right? I'm currently reading This Life by Martin Naklund, and if it's also a very a very socialist book, and he more or less makes the same argument, like that we need to maintain hope, that we need to persist in failure. s- um, I want to build on how to build. I want to ask another question on how to build from failure, because and perhaps this is something that can be tackled in the classroom, because I think both in the United States and the Philippines, discussions now tend to be very intersectional, right? So it's no longer about class, but it must also be about gender and race. And I can also see it in your teaching praxis, Professor Cabusao, because like you talk about all of these three elements along with colonialism and etc. I want to go back to this part of the novel, the specific character Maming, right? So among the characters, Maming is the only female. Um, uh, it's
Oh, I see.
I believe there are technical difficulties. Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just pause before
Oh, sure.
continuing my question. Yeah.
Sure. I'm being asked to restart my video. How do I
Mm.
how do I do that? Do I log off and then start again? Let's see.
Yeah, if you can just Jeff, if you can just turn
Yes.
on and turn off and on your video on Google
Turn
Meet.
on.
You're currently frozen. Yeah, turn
I
off
see.
and
Okay.
turn on again. Yeah, okay, that's good.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much for attending to that technical difficulty. So anyway, my question is about I guess if you only have until 6 local time, perhaps this is my last question. Like, given the intersectional consciousness of students in the classroom, both in the United States and the Philippines, I'd like to ask, like, how can we grapple with internal contradictions, right? Because this is one of my claims in my thesis, that when we look at Carlos Bulosan's work, we tend to focus on external contradictions, right? So it's the conflict between capitalists and workers, farmers and landowners, American imperialists and Filipino subalterns, etc. Right? But the cry and the dedication, and perhaps we can even go back to Carlos Bulosan's older work. It gives us an opportunity to think about internal contradiction. And I would like to ask about Mameng, the specific character from The Cry and the Dedication, because she's the only female revolutionary. And when you said that you were appalled with that, or shocked with Dante's death. I was appalled with Mameng's representation, because Mameng, the only revolutionary, and her task is, okay, she's the only woman here. She needs to identify Felix Rivas, right, for the rendezvous, and the way that she does that is that she needs to have sex with Felix Rivas, right? And it's really bizarre for me that, like, she needs to have sex with Dante first, and that's somehow supposed to make it easier, right? And then she needs to have sex with Felix Rivas to be able to identify him by his deformities, right? And for me, from a 21st century point of view, that's very feminist, right? That's very gendered. That's objectifying, right? And one thing that I remarked in my thesis is that it's like you turn Maming into a pervert, right? In the psychoanalytic sense, that not only does she accept it, she embraces it. She enjoys her instrumentalization, right? So this is my final question. When the young activists and students of today they might look too much at external contradictions. How can teaching Carlos Bulosan in the classroom, specifically the internal contradictions in Carlos Bulosan's work, how can it help students make sense of internal contradictions within progressive movements?
Jeff,
Sure.
excuse me, can you
Yes.
restart or
Yes.
refresh your video again?
Sure. Okay. Okay. Am I coming up now, Francis? Okay. I know we're short on time because we have just a few more minutes left in the session. Is that right, Francis?
Yes, a few more minutes, then we need to entertain one question from the audience.
Sure. Okay. So just very quickly to Victor, and you know, and you know, I would love to, you know, be in correspondence with Victor even after the presentation, and because I would also love to hear from the audience. But I think just a quick response to Victor, I too was also disturbed with the representation of Mameng, you know, when I first read the Cry and the Dedication. I think Mameng is a very interesting character. You know, here I'm thinking of some recent scholarship, well, the scholarship on the Cry and the Dedication that looks at the problematic representation of Mameng, right, which Victor brought up. But at the same time, there's some other recent scholarship. Here I'm thinking of Alan Wald's revisiting the Cry and the Dedication, and his work. He's a literary historian who is very interested in Mameng perhaps representing a sort of a kind of transgender sexual politics because she's dressed as a man. You know, and so what he does is that he situates the Cry and the Dedication into the 1950s, which was a very interesting time in terms of sexual politics in the United States. At that time, 1950s, we have the development of the underground gay movement, the Mattachine Society, Daughters of Bilitis. So it was a very different historical moment. So I think that's also something to remember, to sort of historicize Bulosan in his historic, you know, to help us contextualize his representation, in that we can find limitations of how Mameng is, severe limitations of how Mameng is represented, but also perhaps it is Bulosan's reaching towards some of the sort of interesting sexual politics of that time. And Alan Wald encourages us to look at her as a transgender figure in terms of how she dresses. But I think that that's an excellent question to raise. I think we can point out contradictions in Bulosan's text without dismissing him, you know, because I think pointing out the contradictions help us to understand Bulosan as a fuller human being. At the same time, you know, one of his close friends, Josephine Patrick, towards the end of his life, he was very close to Josephine Patrick, a white woman who was a labor activist, said that out of all the men that she knows, perhaps Bulosan is the most feminist because of his gentleness and thoughtfulness towards women in his life. And in fact, he was nurtured by Dorothy Babb, you know, the Odell sisters in America's in the Heart. But I think pointing out the contradictions, you know, should not be an excuse to dismiss Bulosan. I think it gives us a fuller picture of Bulosan and his craft. You know, but also I think historicizing the text is one, but also, and just to return to your question about the elemental political or dimension of his text, I think maybe looking at his essays and letters at the same time. Oh, go ahead, Francis. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. But you know, so just maybe to finish my point, I think in terms of helping us understand the political dimension of Bulosan, I think juxtaposing America's in the Heart, the Cry and the Dedication, to his letters, and that's collected by Dolores Feria, it would be wonderful if that was republished, so that was widely accessible. Some of those letters appear in the 2019 Penguin edition of America's in the Heart. But I think looking at his essays and his letters, you really see Bulosan theorizing the political function of literature, the political function of the artist. And so you see Bulosan as a theorist in his letters and his essays, which I think is quite fascinating. In many ways, sort of anticipating somebody like a Raymond Williams, the father of British cultural studies, and his notion of cultural materialism. And this is coming from Bulosan, drawing on our own progressive traditions as a Filipino people, which I think is quite fascinating and encouraging, especially in the face of many failures, that you mentioned.
I shall stop now and then give space for.
Sure.
I would like to thank again Professor Cabusao and Mr. Bautista. We are really pressed on time here for that thought-provoking exchange. But the floor is now open for the questions of our audience. So it's time for our audience now to ask the questions. I have here the first question from an anonymous participant. By the way, again, sorry, Jeff, can you please refresh your video again? You're frozen. Okay. Have you refreshed it? You're still frozen.
Sure. And it froze me in a very unflattering.
Yeah, that's why I wanted you to refresh it. And it's still frozen. I don't know what's happening with the internet connection.
Yeah, I turned off the camera. I'll turn it back on.
Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, you're already unfrozen.
Okay.
Okay. So the first question that we have in the context of the continuing race, class, and gender wars between the so-called alternative rights, racist bias, and the colored people in the USA, what might Bulosan and his works teach the Asian Americans in today's struggle for equality and justice? And this is perhaps also related with the first musing of Victor.
Sure. Can you hear me, Francis? Am I coming in?
You're clear.
Clear. Sure. First of all, that's a wonderful and excellent question. And just very quickly, one thing that Bulosan can teach us, and this is what I highlight for my students, is that Bulosan helps us to understand the importance of working class interracial solidarity, right? Solidarity across racial boundaries. Right, we see that in how the Filipino migrant workers paved the way for the United Farm Workers movement of the 1960s. You saw all those manongs from the 1930s, which includes Philip Vera Cruz, who forged solidarity with the Mexican workers, because that's what the alt-right, particularly the elite class, is interested always in pitting marginalized groups against each other. Right, and Alos even witnesses that. The many ways in which marginalized groups, Filipinos pitted against Mexicans, against the Japanese, Filipino migrant workers pitted against poor white women in the Manila dance halls. There are ways in which they're always pitted against each other in the interest of the ruling class. And the ruling class doesn't want us to see how we are actually interconnected. It's in our interest to forge solidarity with other marginalized groups, right? And so that's, I think, one of the major contributions of the Filipino migrant workers of Bulosan's generation, right? In their organizing, they always forged solidarity with other marginalized groups. In fact, Bulosan himself as an author was very interested in Richard Wright, the African-American author who was very progressive, and forging solidarity in terms of his literary craft with the African-American experience. So I think, that's one of the major contributions of Bulosan's body of work and his life, encouraging all marginalized groups to build solidarity. There's a sort of phrase or slogan that came about in the Women's March, which was in dialogue with Black Lives Matter and the immigrant rights movement in the United States. And it's about building bridges, not walls.
Yeah.
And I think Bolosan's work speaks to that.
And we're actually seeing that with the apparent violence due to Asian hate in the recent
Yes.
months. We're actually seeing
Yes.
the unity of other ethnicity as well to battle
Yes.
that kind of violence and Asian hate.
That's right. That's right. That's right. You know, and so and also, you know, I think what Bolosan can teach us too is that the Asian hate that we see in the United States is not new, right?
Yeah.
That's not new.
Mhm.
And Bolosan himself encountered that
just
in the
documented
1930s.
now because of the technology. But without that technology, it may not be broadcast that way. But it exists even before.
That's right. That's right. That's right. And so perhaps that's the other sort of contribution of Bolosan, that he reminds us that the Asian hate that we see is not new. And especially if as Filipinos, when we confront our colonial trauma, we can see the ways in which we've been racialized as others that is not dissimilar to the ways in which African Americans have been racialized as others, or other people of color have been racialized as others. So, so Asian hate is not new. That's one lesson from Bolosan, and that interracial solidarity, working class interethnic solidarity, is key, I think, to pushing back against the violence of the ruling class.
Thank you again, Professor Cabusao, and to Mr. Bautista. UNITAS has lined up a host of activities for the UNITAS centennial celebration, and we hope you can join us again and participate in future events as honored guests.
All right. Thank you so much, Francis.
Thank you.
And thank you, Victor.
Yeah. And we now listen to the closing remarks of the Editor-in-Chief of UNITAS and Scholar-in-Residence at the Faculty of Arts and Letters of UST, President of Cultural, Literary, and Art Studies Incorporated, or CLAS, the Philippines version of the Modern Language Association of America, or MLA, and Editor Emerita of Critica Cultura, award-winning scholar, translator, chair of the Commission on Higher Education's Technical Committee for Literature, none other than Dr. Maria Luisa Torres Reyes.
Magandang hapon po sa inyong lahat. If you recall, perhaps a decade ago, the National Museum honored as national cultural treasures 4 structures in the University of Santo Tomas or UST campus due to their exceptional historical value, namely the main building, the Central Seminary, the Arch of the Centuries, and the grandstand with open spaces. Shortly afterwards, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines declared the University of Santo Tomas campus itself a National Historical Landmark, a place or structure that has contributed greatly to the nation's history. The National Historical Commission, as you know, is the institution responsible for conserving and preserving the country's national legacies. As the citation goes, UST as an institution was being honored for having been, quote, a witness to many significant episodes in the growth of the Filipino nation, unquote. 1922 was one significant episode, an auspicious year for UST and a remarkable one for the nation's history. 1922 was the year the main building of UST started construction, a structure that is now among the iconic symbols of the history of higher education in the country in the popular imagination. But you see, the main building was not born solo in 1922. It was born with a twin named Unitas. For in the same year, Unitas, the journal, was born, I imagine, with the awe and wonder of a Filipino family exhilarated by the birth, not just of a child, but of twins. Like its twin building, therefore, which has been declared a National Historical Landmark, Unitas was destined to be a witness to the nation's history, too. But it was more than a witness, you see. It spoke and made itself heard with research papers and scholarly commentaries year in and year out throughout its pages. In the 1920s, while the main building stood dignified and proud as an important ground zero of knowledge and witness to major cultural, religious, historical, and political events, such as the lively carnivals of Manila during the so-called peacetime, the interwar years, Unitas did not shy away from the urgent issues of the day, as well as from the state of the art in fine scholarly writing in the humanities and the sciences. It published scholarly articles on pioneering, relevant, and compelling topics such as the incubation period of the typhoid infection, the indigenous church, which had its own rise during the revolutionary and nationalist movements, topics like socialism, Filipino music, the status of women, and so many others. Certainly, there were a couple of other pioneering journals during the early American period, say a publication of law students at the University of the Philippines, or a natural science journal published by the government's Department of Health. They also tried to stake new grounds in academic publishing from distinct disciplines. However, then as it is now, Unitas remains, as far as we have uncovered from the archives, the only one of its kind when it was established. And 100 years since 1922, by 2022, Unitas obviously lives on. At the outset, Unitas stood for, well, Unitas, partly because the university wanted to unite different disciplinary publications into one unified publication then. And in the larger context of disciplinary developments at that point, one could say that it was also partly due to the fact that the breadth and scope of humanistic revaluations and scientific discovery at the turn of the century had increased in breadth and scope. All around, it seemed imperative for UST to conjoin its pages and scholarship from the different disciplinary journals under a single flagship publication, which would be called Unitas. And so it was. Still over time, with ever-expanding demand for outlets, scholarly publications would divide up into different journals, following disciplinary divides and specializations from, say, medical science to civil law. In the late 1940s, shortly after the hiatus brought about by the World War II, throughout the country, Unitas continued publication of important and exciting research and scholarship. The conversation with history continues to this day. Today, Unitas has expanded the arena of scholarly conversations with the rest of the world, transforming from a national to an international scholarly publication as befitting a journal with such a long and distinguished past and a dynamic present. We invite you to visit the Unitas website and follow the 100 years of rich intellectual history of this country. That history is written in its pages. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, Ma'am Lulu. And before we end today's program, please allow me to announce the next international lecture. We will be having Professor Alex Taek Guang Lee of Kyung-hee University, Seoul, South Korea. We'll talk about BTS and the national question. This promises to be the most exciting and intellectually stimulating event once more. Indeed. Thank you so much, and see you next month on the 27th of August, Friday. I am Francis Kilantang.